the anger guilt trap and how to start breaking the cycle, I first really want to acknowledge just that you're here, that you're spending your time, space, and energy in watching or listening to this, because anger in motherhood remains such a taboo topic that even broaching it as an area for us to dive into and explore more, that is huge in and of itself. So I really want to acknowledge that first off. I will explain how the anger guilt trap operates, how it works as a cycle, and then I'll take you through step by step, offering you some practical and tangible things that you can do to try and help break this cycle. I will say though from the outset that I tend to resist kind of step-by-step guides. I don't offer any sort of guarantees. I think that actually we're much more complex as human beings than this, that our mothering experiences are much more nuanced than we often give voice to. And so I really want to speak to the normalcy here of the ways that we've experienced anger and are experiencing anger as mothers in our society and culture. And that actually anger is a normal human emotion, right? It's not something that is bad or wrong or that we need to get rid of, but we can make distinctions between the felt experience of anger and how we express that anger. And anger can be something which is really a useful piece of information for us as mothers when we're feeling angry, to ask what's underneath this anger. What is here for me? What am I being called into shifting? What boundaries are being violated of mine? What can I do to set some boundaries, to offer myself some of the things that I'm needing and yearning and craving for right now? It's also to say, though, that there are some things that are bigger than us, right? Some things that we're angry about that we're not going to find solutions to. Some things that we can't implement some step-by-step action process in order to try and solve. Some things are not solvable by us and us alone. And so it's to acknowledge that actually your experience of anger is not just one that is individual, it's part of a collective pattern, something that you are not alone in experiencing, depending on where you're located and what other challenges you're facing in your life, outside of your motherhood as well. That all plays a factor and that all contributes to how you may experience your sense of anger in motherhood and what that looks like for you. So to go into that anger guilt trap in motherhood, we start off the first circle. You have a look at the PDF that I've attached. Open that up as I'm talking through, and so you can follow me through as I explain each of the circles. So the first one is the cultural construction of motherhood. So that's the perfect mother myth. This is this idea that when you become a mother, you not only go through all sorts of changes in your relationships, your sense of identity, your sense of your place in the world, right? And what you care about. You might experience shifts to your paid work, your career. There's all sorts of changes we go through when we become mothers. But a change we also go through that isn't often named is we enter into a social role. So there are a whole bunch of expectations that come with what it means to be a good mother. And a lot of these expectations are actually invisible. They're things that we sort of absorb through our culture, through messaging, through advertising, through our own upbringing. And we absorb them and take them on, and we can internalize them as our own beliefs. And so each of us living within society and culture has absorbed these messages to some extent. And so the first thing here is, when thinking about the cultural construction of motherhood, what does it mean to be a good mother? What's on the pedestal of perfect motherhood? Something that is not included is anger. Selflessness is included, putting others before you, making sure you're catering to everyone else's needs, taking on the mental load, making sure that you're patient, right? And that you're calm and that you're nurturing and that you love motherhood and that you're enjoying every minute and it comes naturally, and on I could go around the perfect mother myth. But importantly here, for the purposes of this video, is to say that anger isn't built into this construction. And this means that whenever we feel anger, let alone even express it, whenever we feel like we're being outcast from the idealized version we've internalized of what it means to be a mother. And so we can take that on as a personal failing, that that's something that we're not doing good enough, the fact that we are even feeling this very normal human emotion, and often very justified one at that. So it starts off in this place of how motherhood is constructed socially. So anger is outcast. The next circle is that when you inevitably feel anger or irritation, impatience, frustration, anything that is part of our broad range of emotions that we experience as mothers, particularly even in the circumstances in which we mother, we then feel guilty, right? So we feel that sense of anger, or we may act out on that sense of anger. And we feel like, you know what, I am not a good enough mother. I'm not cut out for this. Others are coping so much better than I am, right? We make comparisons between ourselves and other mothers. And part of this is not only when it comes to anger, but when it comes to everything else that's part of perfect motherhood. So when it comes to this, a certain way that you look, you know, how you dress your kids, right? Your presence on social media. It could to do with what you feed your kids. That's a huge one that we attach guilt with, feeding. It could have to do with the expectations and pressures you feel from extended family about the way that you should raise your children. Discipline. There are lots and lots of arenas in motherhood, and I'm sure that you'll have some pop up in your mind when I say, what do you feel guilty about as a mother? And so the perfect mother myth and the way that we are carrying these expectations, the result of that is guilt, because none of us can live up to these idealized standards of what it means to be a mother in the way that they're set up. So the third circle then, what happens after we experience this guilt is we can feel like we need to try and make up for that. We need to try and sacrifice more, put more pressure on ourselves to do better, be better, want more, be more. And I think there's a distinction here we can make between wanting to grow and expand and strengthen our skills and our capacity and what it is that we can hold as mothers, which is a constant practice. There's a difference between that and what I'm talking about here, which is, I think of it as like shooting on yourself. You know, you're really getting down on yourself. You're speaking to yourself harshly, not with kindness, but saying, you know, you need to be better than this. You need to do more. And what this can lead to is that we self-sacrifice more. So when, for example, you may be fortunate enough to get an offer of help, for example, with something to do with your children. And our immediate response, without even really thinking about it, can be, oh no, I'm right, I've got this. You know, so we can feel this sense of burden, like that this is our responsibility, this is for us to carry alone. And if we accept help or reach out for help or actually say, you know what, that doesn't work for me and my values as a mother, even though I know I'll be judged for it, we can feel this sense of not fitting in. And that feels uncomfortable. And so what can happen is we loosen our boundaries a little more. So when we're driven by guilt and we're feeling really terrible, like we can't be this version of motherhood that we wanted to be, the next time we may be faced with setting a boundary with our children or with others, we relax that boundary, we loosen it because we're feeling guilty, right? So we try and give more than what we actually have to give. What happens then, moving on to the fourth circle, is that contributes to a sense of resentment. Inevitably, right? It's like your inner self saying, hey, what about me? What about me? I'm carrying everything for this family. I'm doing as much as I possibly can and it doesn't seem to be enough. What about me? And this sense of resentment, I can think of it sometimes like lava that is bubbling away, and it kind of gets hotter and more furious over time. The longer that this goes on, the longer that you're feeling that you're giving your sense of everything, you're giving your all to your children, to your family, to others, and you have nothing left to give. This sense of feeling unappreciated, feeling unacknowledged, unseen, invisible in all that you do and that you carry. And what that eventually will lead to is when the lava gets hot enough and bubbles away enough for a long enough period of time or in an intense enough way, we will then be faced with a trigger of some sort. Often this will come through our mothering of our children. They will do something to set us off, so to speak. And what happens is we can draw on this evocative language of being set off, losing it, flipping our lid, cracking it, running out of patience. And that's when you snap, right? And you can look up Dan Siegel's model of flipping your lid. It explains the physiology of this really well. And what happens is that's when anger can turn into rage, right? Which is the next circle here. So you experience that trigger, which could be really small. It could be your toddler knocking over a glass of water, or it could be something bigger. You get a bill in that you can't pay. You have a big fight with your spouse if you have one. Any number of things it could be that could trigger you. And then the last circle here is the expression of that as rage and as anger. And that's when it can feel really unsettling. It can feel unsafe at times. It can feel like we're out of control. And it can feel really scary. It can feel really unsettling. And it can feel like we've unlocked this part of ourselves that we didn't even know existed before we became mothers. And most of the women I speak to around this say something along the lines of, I never was an angry person before I became a mother. And you may not even identify as an angry person, right? Just because we experience anger and rage does not mean that defines all of us and all of who we are. So what then happens though, as I'm sure I don't have to point this out, but after you experience that flipping of your lid, that expression of anger as rage, then comes in the guilt, the terrible sense of guilt and of shame. So guilt in being, I have failed here according to these standards of what it means to be a mother. This is not the environment I want to create for my children. This is not the way that I wanted to be living my life. This does not feel good to me, for me. And also shame, right? Because then we can make it mean something about us, that we're just not good enough, that we weren't cut out for this, that we're a terrible mother. And what then happens, you can see this cycle continues, right? Because we then try and live up to these expectations in an even intensified way. We self-sacrifice more, the resentment bubbles away, we are faced with a trigger, we lose it, and around we go. And this could be something that we go through every day even. So I want to give you some tips and strategies here. Again, kind of flagging that this is not a cure-all solution, but it's something that I think will go some way in not only intervening in that snapping phase. So that's what a lot of focus is on when thinking about anger management and how to be, a calm mom or peaceful mom. We talk about a whole bunch of strategies, which is actually at the end of this cycle. So how to stop yourself from flipping your lid when you're about to go into rage. And I'll share with you a strategy to help with that. There are lots out there. But what I want to do here, which I don't think is done nearly enough, I've not seen it done and spoken about in this way, which is why I'm so passionate about bringing this information to you more broadly, is to go back around the cycle. So instead of just intervening at this end point when we're about to lose it, when the rage is about to be expressed, let's go back in the cycle and work back right up to the top and examine the ways that we've internalized the perfect mother myth to begin with. Examine the ways that our society and culture have set up on a pedestal a particular way to be a mother. And examine that critically and ask yourself, is this how I want a mother? What are my values here? So the first exercise for you to do is to write out on a sheet of paper, what does being a good mother mean to me? And really allow yourself some freedom with this stream of consciousness writing. You might want to use different terminology. So for some, what being a good mother means to me might work. Others, the perfect mother is, or the ideal mother is. Or if you have in your mind a mother that you compare yourself to, that you just think that she's nailing this motherhood thing and you are not, write out the description of her. Okay, so what I'm asking you to do here is to get out on paper something you can visualize and interrogate the things that we've internalized around what it means to be a mother. Now, the second step here is that out of this list, there will be a bunch of things that are a part of your values, things that are actually really important to you and are things that you would like to integrate and keep within your value system, your family system, your way of living and being as a mother. And those things are really important. So as you go through this list, for each thing, ask yourself, is this something that is important to me? Is this my value, or is this a should that I've inherited? And when I say, is this a should that I've inherited, I mean literally, generationally, what have been the patterns of motherhood in your family? And how are you challenging them or not living up to them enough? And more broadly, right? What are the rules that we're following that we didn't even set and we don't even agree with? Okay, so once we go through that exercise, even in its simplest form like that, we can then go to the next step and say, okay, well, where am I feeling guilty about not living up to these standards? Where am I most feeling guilty in my motherhood? Then ask ourselves, is it something that we have a choice over, or is it a necessity? Paid work is a great example of this, right? If we're feeling guilty about going to work and having our child in daycare, or we're feeling guilty about the hours we work and utilizing other people to come in and help care for our children, or this can be to do with food and feeling as though you're not cooking, organic food, or whatever it means for you and your values and your life, write it down, externalize it, and ask yourself, is this something I'm beating myself up over that I actually don't have control over? I actually have to work. I actually don't have a choice here. And if that's the case, how can I highlight what benefits me and my child and my family are receiving by the way things currently are? Even if the guilt is there, even if we know there are drawbacks, what are the positives? What are the things that are enriching about the way things are that I'm not able to currently see because my vision is so clouded by this fog of guilt, by this fog of shame, right? And so when we ask ourselves, is this a necessity? Is this something that we have to do, or is this a choice? And we go, you know what, well, maybe this is a choice. Maybe this is something that I have some freedom in shifting and changing here around the guilt that I feel. Then ask, how can it call you into either shifting your values, realigning your focus, or shifting your behavior? Is there something that you can do differently? Can you creatively engage in this problem and think, okay, what am I going to do with this guilt? How can I shift this current situation? Is it within my power to do so? Who can I call on for help here? What can I do? So really the point of this next part of the exercise, after really describing and putting down on paper what the perfect mother myth means for you and where you're most feeling guilt, is to then use your guilt, use it effectively. Because when we sit in guilt, when we just carry it around with us in our motherhood, it actually is a disconnecting tool between us and our children. So kind of tragically and even somewhat ironically, it can perpetuate the disconnection that we actually are feeling guilty about. And I talk a lot more on this in other forums, and check out my podcast if you want to hear more. But feeling guilty and carrying that around does nothing for us. It does nothing for our children. So let's use it. Use it to either show ourselves where we want to drop the expectations that we've internalized and that others are placing on us, or where we would like to actually make a shift and make a change in our lives and in our mothering. The next here is that if we're at a stage where we feel as though we're making up for guilt, that we're self-sacrificing, highlight all of the ways that us and our children are actually benefiting by the thing that we're feeling guilty around, right? There will be benefits hidden there. It can sometimes be really hard and painful to pull them out. But to also notice that if we are self-sacrificing, if we do feel like we have to give more, what would it feel like to just pause right where we are? Right? Not give more, not give less, not do more, not do less, but just pause. So what I'm asking you to do here is to come into presence. So what would that feel like? What would that look like for you to come into greater presence and awareness? And oftentimes coming into the moment, into greater presence, helps shifting that guilt, because guilt is something that we often ruminate on, and we're reflecting on how we could do things different, how we could be better. And sometimes that means that we're missing what's happening right in front of us right now. The next part here is, where are you feeling invisible, unacknowledged, unseen, and unappreciated? Use that as a journaling prompt and see what comes out. A lot of the time here, what ends up coming out as something that we want to shift and work on is redistribution of domestic labour, so of household labour, of who is doing the care work and the domestic work within the home, finding a way to build in more equity into that, to bring in more support, to outsource, to delegate, to drop, and making visible the mental load. So all of the things that you carry in your mind, externalizing them, popping it on an Excel sheet, getting post-it notes, putting them on the wall, writing out all of the things there, writing a list, getting a shared calendar app. Anything that you can do to have all this up here out of your head in some way, because it helps make it visible. And it's really hard for others and even ourselves to value what remains invisible. So we make it visible in order to build a bridge to value in it. The next thing is around the trigger points. And this is where I suppose the more common strategies are spoken about in terms of dealing with anger in motherhood. There are plenty of strategies you can draw on here. I'm going to share with you just one. This is the technique of ruler, the approach. So this is from the Yale School of Emotional Intelligence, and it's what we can do when we feel as though we've just moved into a trigger, or What happens often is the circle of security, I think, describe this as shark music. So you will hear this kind of shark music in the background when you're feeling your kind of heart racing, when you're feeling your temperature rising, when you're feeling flushed, when you're feeling like you're going to lose, that you're on the edge. I describe it as you're holding onto the edge of a cliff and you're carrying this backpack and it gets heavier and heavier and heavier. And it might just be like one more sippy cup into that backpack and whoa, that is enough. You are letting go. You are falling off the edge of that cliff. You cannot hold on anymore. So what we want to do is we want to recognize when our grip is becoming really hard to hold on. Like we are going to lose it soon if we don't intervene and do something. So the ruler approach from the Yale School of Emotional Intelligence say RULER is what it stands for, obviously. So the first is recognize. So that's just recognizing, oh, this is what's happening. I'm starting to get upset. I'm starting to get angry. I'm starting to get triggered here. Then understanding. So, okay, what is triggering me? What is triggering me here? Is it the noise? Is it a sensory input? Do I need to shift my body, my positioning? Do I need to take a few breaths? Am I shallow breathing? What can I do here? What am I being triggered by? And how can I respond to that in a way rather than react to that right now? The next then is to label. This is coming back to that technique. I'm sure many of you have heard of it, of name it to tame it. So as soon as we name our emotion, we activate parts of our brain, our thinking parts of our brain, which is what goes, so-called offline when we go into that flight or fight response and we go into the rage response. So name it to tame it is a really useful strategy to think about bringing in here too. Then expressing it. So expressing, this is how I'm feeling. This is how I'm feeling right now. Just putting words to it. This can just be to yourself. A technique that you can develop here to really help with this and processing of anger more broadly is to have a listening partnership. So a friend, and you have half an hour every week where you're on the phone to each other and you just purely 15 minutes each, you just listen to each other. It's no advice, it's no strategies, it's no anything. You just are being heard and listened to, and that can be really powerful. So express, and then the last is in the moment to regulate. So there are lots of different ways that you can regulate. You can run your wrists underwater. You can do breathing exercises. You can do visualizations. Some people enjoy bringing in kind of scent or smell, changing your sensory experience, right? Getting outside immediately if you can. Even some mums find it really useful to even have some headphones to sort of, or little earplugs to just dull the intensity of the noise. And shaking is another one you can use here. There's lots and lots of ways to regulate. You can Google them and you'll find a ton if you look up nervous system regulation. And so that can be a way to help you in the moment in the experience of being triggered. That is to say, all of that work, and if you need support in that area, I would really encourage you to see if you can book in with a psychologist. If you haven't already, reach out for some additional support. Know that maternal mood disorders, sometimes the symptoms can be experienced through rage and anger, postpartum depression and anxiety. It can be a symptom of that. But to also say that actually we don't have to pathologize what are really common experiences in motherhood that are the result of the social and cultural systems that many of us are embedded within, where we are mothering alone without adequate support. We are not well resourced and supported in the ways of our daily lives, right? Particularly in the context of the pandemic. And all that we are carrying, all that we are doing, and it so often is undervalued and not recognized. So I hope that this has gone some way into explaining how anger and guilt are connected, how we can start to push back against some of these processes, how we can start to break some of these cycles, and ultimately how we can start to bring in self-compassion for ourselves, right? To know that shame, isolation, guilt, all of this only pushes these feelings down, only isolates us further, and that only exacerbates our challenging experiences of anger and guilt and isolation in motherhood. I know it's taboo. I know it's hard to speak about. I know that you won't necessarily be able to spark a conversation with another mum friend about this because it doesn't feel necessarily safe to go there, but to just know that you are not alone, You're absolutely not alone. And that the time that you've taken to watch this, I'm really wanting to honor that. And I hope that once you start to put some of these strategies in place, carve out that little bit of time and space, even though I know we don't often have much of it, but if we can carve out that little bit of time and space for us to do some of this work and start to implement some of these things, it will go a long way into shifting our relationship with anger and what that can mean for us.